The Curse of the Werewolf.
It was half animal and half man. The upper part, I would have said, was a wolf, and the lower part was human.
Tonight's episode is about an archaeologist who received a mysterious package containing two strange stone carvings. But it was only after bringing them into her home that the evil contained within the stones revealed itself. The stones held an ancient curse that plunged her family into a supernatural nightmare of werewolves and poltergeists. Then, one day, the stones mysteriously disappeared. To this day, the origins of the stones and their curse has never been explained. Welcome to Paranormal FM, your home of the strange, unexplained, and all things that go bump in the night. If that sounds like the kind of thing you enjoy, then give this episode a like and subscribe for more content. This is the horrific curse of the Hexham heads. Dr. Anne Ross sat down and stared curiously at the strange little box now resting on her living room table. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied up with string. But what made this package so unusual was that there was no return address or any indication of where it was from. The only writing on the paper was a handwritten note of Dr. Ross's name and address. The handwriting looked like it was rushed, as if whoever sent it was unusually keen to get rid of it. Receiving unusual packages in the post was nothing new to Dr. Ross. She was a well-respected archaeologist and professor of antiquities. People often sent her historical artifacts for analysis, although they weren't typically sent in unmarked packages like this. She carefully removed the paper and revealed a cardboard box. It was just as plain as the paper that packaged it. As soon as she touched the box, an intense sensation of cold ran up her arm. It felt like she had just placed it in a bucket of cold water. She paused, shaken by the strange sensation, but after taking a deep breath, she composed herself and slowly opened the box. Contained within it were two stone heads, each around the size of a tennis ball. They looked to be Celtic, but they had an unusually grotesque, almost sinister quality that she hadn't seen in other Celtic artifacts. She examined the objects and saw that despite them being of similar weight and size, there were some clear differences. While both heads had rudimentary faces carved into them, the darker one appeared to have masculine features, and the stone used to carve it was a greenish grey with flecks of quartz crystals, giving it an almost shimmery appearance. The lighter stone was more feminine, but it looked like the carving of a witch or a hag, rather than the typical representation of a woman. Below each of their heads was stumpy little necks, indicating they may have been connected to something, like a body or pedestal at some point. It was then she noticed that the room had grown uncomfortably cold, and she was suddenly filled with a distinct feeling she was no longer alone. A few nights later, she woke in a cold sweat, and as consciousness returned, it brought with it a creeping sense of fear and dread. A feeling that there was something else, something sinister and uninvited in the room with her. She recognized it as the same feeling she experienced when she first saw the two stone heads. She turned to her husband, who was sleeping, Then, in the corner of her eye, she saw a large shadow creeping across the bedroom. But it was only when it reached the open doorway and was now illuminated by the hallway lights that she saw the horrific nature of the thing. It was a massive, bipedal creature that, despite stooping to fit under the door, still stood at over 6 foot tall. From the waist down, it was a man, but from the chest up, it was a wolf, covered in coarse black hair. It turned and walked out the room, and Dr. Ross listened as its heavy footsteps padded across the landing and down the stairs. Despite her initial fear, she felt a sudden and irresistible urge to follow the creature, and leapt out of bed to run after it. By the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, it was moving to the back of the house, and whatever force had compelled her to follow the creature relinquished its hold. Fear once more took over as she realised that although she had been aware of her actions, she wasn't in control of them. She ran back upstairs and woke her husband, but after searching the house, they found no sign of the werewolf-like creature. The story of the Hexham Heads starts innocuously enough, with 11-year-old Colin Robson playing with his brother Leslie in the back garden of their family home at 3 Reed Avenue in Hexham, Northumbria. The game they were playing consisted of digging up small pebbles and throwing them at one another, when Colin suddenly cried out and pulled something from the earth. In his hand, he held a round object, about the size and weight of a cricket ball. He cleaned off the dirt and realised it was a miniature stone head. The two boys, fascinated by the strange discovery, started digging for others, and it wasn't long until Leslie found another stone head. It was around the same size and weight as the one that Colin had unearthed. Once they brushed off the dirt, they ran inside to show their mother, Jenny Robson, what they had found. Jenny was in the kitchen at the time, and she smiled to herself when she looked up and saw the boys running excitedly, but her stomach dropped when she saw the strange stone heads they were holding. The heads held a weirdly grotesque quality to them, and exuded an inexplicable air of malice. She tried to ignore it, but she couldn't help noticing a distinct change in the atmosphere of the home. It was an indescribable feeling of something having been disturbed, a malevolence once dormant, which was now awakened. The first indication that something was wrong came the following morning, when she came down and found the heads now turned towards the garden, facing the very area they were found. She shrugged it off and put the heads back in their original positions, but the next day the heads had moved again. A short time later, the activity surrounding the heads became more violent. It started with the heads rolling around on their own, but soon the family was kept awake by loud thuds in the night, as the heads threw themselves across the room, and on more than one occasion they were found in completely different rooms. But the haunting of the Hexham Heads had only just begun. It was around this time that the family started to sense that there was something else in the home. It was a feeling of never being alone, and a constant sense of being watched. Soon the poltergeist activity spread throughout the house. It started with the sound of taps running in the bathroom, but every time Jenny or her husband went to investigate, no one was there. Books and vases were pushed from shelves onto the floor. pictures on the walls would move on their own. Lights flickered, despite there being no issues with the electricity, and large items of furniture moved during the night. The first sign of the activity escalating was when bottles were violently thrown across the room. Then, one night, the Robsons were awoken by the sound of glass smashing in the living room. They ran to investigate and found a window had exploded in its frame. This would be the first of a series of glass objects inexplicably shattering in the house, and was the start of the haunting taking on a more sinister and threatening tone. Even though the glass from the shattered objects was carefully collected and disposed of, large shards of glass was later found in the beds and hidden under the pillows of the children. As the activity intensified, it simultaneously focused its attention on the children, specifically Colin, who woke up several times in the middle of the night screaming that he'd felt invisible hands pulling his hair as he slept. The first sign the haunting had spread beyond the family home was when a large flower blossomed in the area the heads had been dug up. The flower glowed with such intensity that it looked like someone was shining a light on it. But the most disturbing development was the sound of a baby crying from outside. But each time they went out to investigate, they found nothing. Then, a few nights later, the Robson family were awoken by terrified screams coming from the Dodd family next door. The Dodd family had been experiencing strange phenomena of their own ever since Colin and Leslie Robson had found the stone heads. The poltergeist activity the Dodd family experienced was similar to that of the Robson family, at least to start with, but it rapidly developed into something far more violent. The youngest child, Trevor Dodd, woke up covered in bite marks that looked like those of a large dog. These nighttime attacks were preceded by a distinct smell of a wet dog in the house. And on one occasion, Nellie Dodd, Trevor's mother, felt an unseen, furry presence knock her to the ground. But tonight was a terrifying culmination of a series of increasingly frightening occurrences in the Dodd family home. Nellie was sat in a chair, watching over her daughter Marie as she slept. Marie had been suffering from a particularly severe ear infection, and Nellie was keeping an eye on the fever she'd been running. At some point during the night, she dozed off, but was jolted awake by the sound of screams filling the room. She looked over and saw Marie sat bolt upright in bed. Her face was frozen in a look of sheer terror. Nellie opened her mouth to reassure her, but felt her blood run cold as she sensed a presence in the room. Then Marie slowly raised her hand and pointed shakily to the doorway behind her. Nellie turned and stood in the doorway was a horrific apparition of a huge goat-headed creature. It had the body of a man, but it was stood on two huge hind legs and was reaching for Marie with a taloned claw covered in dark fur. Nellie's screams merged with those of her daughter, creating a cacophony of horror which woke the Robsons next door. The creature then turned and calmly walked away. Nellie ran over to her daughter, and the two women huddled together in terror as they listened to its heavy footsteps pad down the stairs and towards the front door. Nellie's husband Isaac was awoken by the noise, and when they told him what had happened, he ran downstairs and found the front door he'd personally locked an hour ago now wide open. When Jenny Robson learned of the Dodds' experience, she realised that the force attached to the heads was not only growing stronger, but it was spreading. It was around this time they learned of Dr. Anne Ross and sent the heads and the curse onto her. The werewolf that stalked Dr. Ross would reappear to her 15-year-old daughter Bernice a few days later. What makes this particularly compelling is that Bernice didn't know about her mother's earlier werewolf encounter. It was 4 p.m. and Bernice had just returned home from school. She knew her parents wouldn't be home for another couple of hours, but today the house felt unusually quiet. It was then she noticed the family cat that always greeted her when she came home was missing. She was about to call out when she heard a loud hiss coming from the corner. She looked over and saw the cat hiding behind a chair. Its back was arched with its hackles raised. She took a step towards the cat and it hissed again. She froze in her tracks. Then she realised that the cat wasn't hissing at her, but something behind her. Its eyes were fixed on something at the top of the stairs. She turned and gasped as a large shadow moved across the landing. And then, from the darkness, a huge creature covered in black fur sprang forwards and landed halfway down the staircase. It turned its huge wolf-like head to the sky and sniffed the air, then stared hungrily at Bernice. Its lips drew slowly back into a snarl, revealing 2 sets of sharp white teeth. And as it sniffed again, a long line of saliva dripped from its open mouth. It stepped forwards, and Bernice released a scream of pure terror. The creature then jumped over the banister and landed with a gentle thud that belied its immense size, then ran towards the music room at the back of the house. Just like her mother, Bernice felt an inexplicable and uncontrollable urge to follow the creature. But when she got there, it had disappeared. The creature's disappearance brought with it the horrifying reality of what she'd just experienced. And as the blood drained from her face, she collapsed to the floor, sobbing tears of fear and relief. And that is how her parents found her when they returned home later that evening. This would be the second of several sightings of a werewolf-like creature seen by the family. Over the next few weeks, it would be seen standing in doorways. Doors would mysteriously open on their own, and cold spots would be felt throughout the house. It was around this time Bernice had a second close encounter with the creature. One evening, she was taking a meal up to her father, who was sick in bed, when the werewolf materialised before her on the staircase. But when she screamed, it once more jumped over the banister and disappeared. It turns out that werewolf sightings were nothing new to the residents of Hexham, where their heads were found. But Dr. Ross, living 300 miles away in Southampton, didn't know this. Sightings of strange wolf-like creatures have persisted in Hexham ever since 1904, when a wolf slaughtered huge numbers of sheep on the moors above the village. The ferocity of the killings terrified the villagers, who thought it was only a matter of time until it began attacking people. The villagers hunted the wolf for months without success, until one day the mutilated corpse of a large wolf was found dead on the rail tracks. It had been cut in half by a passing train. Investigators were quick to assure villagers that the wolf responsible for the killings was now dead, but the villagers were unconvinced. And when a short time later the killings continued, the villagers began to suspect the wolf was back, or perhaps it had never left. As the story of the Hexham heads spread locally and in the national press, many began to suspect that the heads held a dark, supernatural power and were somehow responsible for unleashing the vengeful spirit of the wolf reported in 1904. Newspapers went as far as to describe the heads as evil and eerie, further reinforcing the aura of mystery and danger that surrounded them. The mystery that surrounded the heads was partly due to the difficulties experts had in identifying and dating them. The heads have been analysed by several universities, historians and archaeologists, but no one could agree on their origins. Dr. Anne Ross believed they were most likely used for worship by a Celtic tribe some 1800 years ago. Severed heads were typically dropped down into wells or buried near forts and believed to offer protection in battle and from enemy raids. There was even debate around what the heads were made from, with some claiming they were made from sandstone and others arguing they were made from an unknown cement-like substance. A chemist named Don Robbins believed that the stones held properties that allowed them to absorb memories or spirits, and in the right conditions, the stones would replay the memories or spirits they contained, like a tape recorder on repeat. This is a variation of the stone tape theory, which gained prominence in the late 19th century. The theory was thrust back into the mainstream in 1972 by a horror movie called The Stone Tape, which was coincidentally released a year after the discovery of the Hexham heads. Despite disagreement about the origins and composition of the heads, there was one thing they all agreed on. The Hexham heads were of immense historical importance. That was until 1974, when Les Craigie, a local man who lived at 3 Reed Avenue before the Robson family moved in, came forward. He told the Evening Chronicle that he made the heads for his daughter, after which they were left in the garden and forgotten about. Dr. Ross dismissed his claims as a work of fiction, and when he was challenged to recreate the heads, it was found that although they were similar in appearance, the method Craigie used to make the replicas was a completely different method to the one used to make the originals. The heads eventually found their way into the hands of Frank Hyde, and almost as a portent of what was to come, Hyde was involved in a serious car accident shortly after taking possession of the heads. Fortunately, he survived the crash, but a short time after his recovery, he disappeared in mysterious circumstances, and neither he nor the heads have been seen since. In the words of Don Robbins, Frank Hyde seemed to have vanished as completely as if he'd walked into a fairy hill in a folk tale. It's an appropriately mysterious and creepy end to one of the most mysterious and creepy artifacts ever discovered. When I first started researching this, and I saw werewolves and haunted ancient artifacts, it sounded like M.R. James and Hammer Horror had a baby. But it's turned out to be so much more complex than that. So let's review the theories about what really happened. The most down-to-earth explanation is that the stones were misidentified objects created by Des Craigie, And while this is possible, it relies on several experts in their field, from historians, university professors and archaeologists, all being duped by a father carving rocks in his garden. It's not impossible, but it does sound a little far-fetched, particularly as Craigie wasn't able to replicate the heads when challenged to do so. The problem is that there was never a consensus regarding the age, origin, or composition of the heads, and their disappearance makes it impossible to verify if they were an ancient or much more recent creation. But the mystery surrounding the heads is only partly due to their origins. The reason they're still spoken about to this day is due to the strange events that accompanied them. The Robson family reported strange events almost as soon as they uncovered the heads, which also affected their neighbours, the Dodds. Nellie Dodd reported seeing a creature that was half man, half goat. And when Dr. Anne Ross received the stones, both she and her daughter had experiences with a werewolf-like creature in their home. A story came out shortly after Nellie's encounter, which has been used to explain her sighting. It said that a group of locals got drunk and stole meat from the local slaughterhouse. One of the men was carrying the carcass of a sheep over his back, and this created the illusion of the half-man, half-goat monster that Nellie reported seeing. One problem with this explanation is that Nellie reported seeing the creature in her house, not walking outside. But more significantly, there were no reports of meat or dead animals being stolen from the local slaughterhouse. Anne Ross's reports are typically explained as her being influenced by the strange experiences reported by the Robson and Dodd families, although she denies any knowledge of these at the time she received the heads. And then there's a question of why a respected historian would risk their reputation by reporting werewolves in their home. It doesn't look like she had anything to gain by making it up, and when she wrote about the heads, it was only ever in the context of their historical significance. She never released any books or made any attempt to profit from her story. It seems the only thing she got from talk about her experiences was ridicule and questions over her credibility. The final chapter in the story of the Hexham heads is their strange disappearance. Neither they nor Frank Hyde have ever been found, and in their absence, we're left with a mystery that will never be solved. That's all from Paranormal FM. Thank you for sharing your evening with me. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks again, and be sure to join me next time.